Together, we're going to look at a practical case in the workplace. We're going to take it apart and think about what's going on, what should happen, and some other things that are worth thinking about in a particular situation. Lee believes they are being stalked by a vendor who visits the job site. When on the site, the vendor always seems to be near Lee, no matter how evasive Lee is, and despite Lee having requested and been allowed to change work areas. The vendor is constantly complimenting Lee and staring at Lee. Lee is concerned that raising the issue won't do any good because it will be hard to prove that the vendor is violating conduct rules. Because of this, Lee thinks that a supervisor just talking to the vendor could make things worse or more dangerous. So here we have a situation in which Lee is experiencing unwelcome behavior in their work environment. When we talk about harassing behavior, we often think of very extreme kind of behavior. But in this particular case, we're dealing with persistent low-level behavior, unwelcome compliments, staring, and seeking proximity, always trying to be around Lee. Lee has done the right thing. Lee has asked to have their work area changed, and the employer has accommodated it. It doesn't sound, however, that Lee has explained to their employer why they want to make this change. If Lee had said, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this vendor, and this vendor is seeking proximity, I'd like to move, the employer would have been obligated to take action to address it. But instead, Lee has tried to solve the problem themselves. And there's really nothing wrong with this, except that it hasn't solved the problem. In this particular case, Lee is reluctant to complain because the behavior is subtle. For this reason, what we might encourage Lee to do is to start keeping a log of this behavior. At the end of each day, or during breaks or lunch, Lee should simply jot down that the vendor was on site on a particular day, where the vendor was, how the vendor approached Lee or came to be near Lee, and whether this was related to the vendor's duties on the job site. Lee also should document anything that Lee did to evade this. Did Lee leave the area? Did Lee ever speak up and object? If Lee approaches their supervisor with this documentation, Lee should have a high level of confidence that the supervisor will take this seriously. Now, there's always a certain degree of anxiety or fear that when someone knows that they've been the subject of a complaint, that something will get worse or go wrong, or that that individual will become hostile. In this particular case, the employer has a great deal of influence. Having somebody as a vendor is absolutely optional to the employer, and the employer can make abundantly clear to the vendor that either they must desist from this behavior or the vendor relationship will end. In fact, if the behavior is severe enough, the employer might decide that they're not even going to give the vendor a chance and decide that Lee's safety and comfort is sufficiently important that they're going to remove this vendor from the workplace or at least prohibit them from being present when Lee is also at the workplace. Lee's fear and concern about negative things happening from the vendor, therefore, should be allayed. And certainly, Lee should understand that there are very strong prohibitions against any kind of retaliation for speaking up about something that's happening in the workplace that shouldn't be happening. If Lee were to experience for having reported, their responsibility would be to bring this to someone who is not part of the retaliation and have that looked into, or to go to an outside enforcement agency, such as the EEOC, to say that they've been retaliated against for, in good faith, reporting misconduct in their workplace.